Yeah.
You're looking at or listening to Highlights Podcast featuring your host, Mike Spivey. Before I take a moment to jump into this, we're talking about the demonization of cannabis. This kind of strikes a note with me in a more serious fashion because there's a lot of implications behind this, and I can't put my fingers on everything and make it concise and say that it's perfectly this way. But the misinformation, the misrepresentation, the misinterpretation of cannabis on those many different levels, it's it's somewhat shaming because I really believe that a lot of this is, let's put it like this, had it never been misunderstood, it may have posed a benefit and changed the quality of life of a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But as I just mentioned, when you're talking about when you're going to demonize something, to me, there's three factors that are going to be involved. The first being misinterpretation, and when we talk from a historical aspect, I mentioned in the history of cannabis, and now we're talking a little bit about the history of misrepresentation, misinterpretation, misinformation of cannabis. Those are the three heads of deception in this situation. And they're pretty much applicable to anything that you're going to demonize. But let's start with misinterpretation. Earlier, when I mentioned the East Indian Company being a British trading company that basically dealt with economics abroad, and they became somewhat of a political entity with a lot of influence, so much to the extent that Parliament had to take them over so that they could orchestrate more closely their workings. And in the East Indian Trading Company, I mentioned there was a doctor, I couldn't find his name, but I believe he was probably the first to misrepresent cannabis on the level of making it an ingredient of an opiate, as well as he made observation on the Indian on the Indian community, and his observations were that it made the people lazy or drugged out, and it was a waste of time. So his first statement, about the misinformation or misrepresentation, he said that cannabis came from the belladonna. No, he said that the opiate he was supposedly observing came from a belladonna nightshade plant and bong. Bong is another word for cannabis, marijuana, but just in India, ganja as well as another word that they use for it. But you have to look at it from the colonizer side of it, and not say they were nowhere near right. because they misjudged what was actually going on in that culture, because there's no way that he could actually understood what was going on in that culture. I mentioned that there were two facets of the Indian culture that actually embraced hemp, cannabis in different ways and part of their spirituality.
Know what it is?
So my theory is that British culture really didn't understand what they were looking at when they was observing the Indian culture and the more resinous nature of the plant and how it works. Now, what I did suggest is that cannabis and an opiate may have a very similar effect, but they're two different plants. There's a lot of process in the opiates that makes it substantially different than cannabis, but the main defining point in that is that cannabis doesn't have an addictive nature. Some of you might have talked yourself into believing that, but it was classified along with other drugs, present day and in the past, that have an addictive nature. So much so that it kind of demonized the plant from early on. So we're really looking at the history of demonization of cannabis right now, because we're looking at the instance where the European British people were observing it and they were misinformed, but the Indian people who actually utilized it felt that it did have a beneficial and substantial meaning to some portions of their religion as well as their health and its nutritional value. As we progress with this thought a little bit further in time, after Parliament took over the East Indian Company, the goal was for taxation. So they did try to tax cannabis according to weight, then by potency, but it was something that was hard to manage. The first sign of misinformation of cannabis in India was actually taking place in the aristocratic class, the ruling class, so to speak, which made them come to the conclusion that it created social unrest. This is the term that was actually used. And there was no social unrest with the plant. And for just as much as people put propaganda out there about cannabis, there's always an opposing group of people who's able to disprove that. So India at one point wanted to ban cannabis, the ruling class did, but the occupiers needed that tax money, so they couldn't do that. But there was a study. Let me peep this out over here real quick so I can give you accurate information on it.
Yeah.
And enterprising classes of the community are among those who use bong, which means that they use marijuana. And like I said previously, just as many people, just as many times that they come up with misinformation, there's always been information that proves the opposite. And it's generally accurate information. There was an actual study done that showing that cannabis didn't do anything to the Indian folks. But I do believe that the English observers, the traders, just didn't understand what was going on. They couldn't embrace the idea that it had a religious aspect to it, or it invoked a different level of understanding in religion. They just couldn't understand or grasp that fact. What can you say? But you can't say it's wrong and you can't say it's evil just because you don't understand it. And across our history, things that have been misunderstood have often been demonized. fuck it, I'ma just go there. Like, I feel like the plan has been demonized the way that black people have been demonized in this country, in this world, whatever. I had thought about not sharing my personal thoughts, but fuck it. Here I am. We're gonna have candid conversations and understand the potential of this. Like, there's certain points that I brought up that should truly be observed. Like, if you're smart, you'll be paying attention. There's a boom going on in this country. Slowly but surely, the plan is becoming legal. It was part of an ancient economic system, and it's still a viable commodity in current day, where they're talking about this is going to provide billions of dollars of tax revenue, state by state. Or maybe not billions, millions, but it's going to create a surplus. It's time that people actually understand it. Like I was saying earlier, I had a family member who could have benefited from the use of cannabis, and we didn't find out till late, but it could have really changed the quality of her life. Synthesized drugs, still some of them are used on a plant basis. But that's what became popular, that started phasing out the snake oil drugs of the past, whether it was in Europe or whether it was here. People walked around with drugs that had God knows what in it. But it also had the ingredients. At some point, they had to list the ingredients, but it held bad companies, so bad assumptions were made. And upon those bad assumptions, it was a lot of misrepresentation, misinterpretation, and it happened back then to now. But customarily, if people didn't deal with the resinous variety of the plant, it was probably a social reason. Ancient Asians didn't really mess with it on that level because they looked at it as an intoxicant. So did the Arab communities. We'll say Middle Eastern communities looked at it as an intoxicant. As you move forward in history, we see the medicinal effects of hemp because it wasn't of a resinous variety. But when we saw that it did have a psychotropic effect, they demonized it. They tried to make it something that was against the government. In the case of India, they couldn't prove that. Let's take the time to really think about what this is. There's a lot of people that can benefit from it, and it doesn't take being high to benefit from the plant. I want to venture out to say that it really doesn't matter if you deal with it psychotropically. Keep it 100. I'd rather a blunt than a shot of Hennessy. At least my liver won't be hurting after the blunt. This is just food for thought tonight about the history of demonization of cannabis, because it's going on far too fucking long. Period. That's just the bottom line. So let's look at it for what it really is. Sometimes, things can be kind of fun, but this is something that's kind of dear to me. Like, I really feel like somebody that was really special to me missed out on the benefits of something because of her perceptions of it. And when she did decide to give it some light, some shine, it was damn near too late. Well, love and peace. Food for thought. Mike Spivey. Highlights.